Hello, I want to welcome everyone participating in today's webinar, The Board Members Guide to Nonprofit Governance During COVID-19. My name is Dunya Jo, and I am a Senior Auditor at GRF CPAs Advisors, and I will be today's moderator. I'd like to start off today with some quick housekeeping items and explain what you will need to do to earn CPE credit. Participants seeking CPE credit today must complete and submit a short evaluation survey that will appear automatically following the webinar. You will be asked to recall these words in order to receive credit. Please write down the CPE words when they're given and keep them until you receive your certificate. They will not be provided again. If you have any technical questions or issues during the discussion, please use the questions function to speak with our administrator for assistance. The slide deck and recording from today's discussion will be available on the event page on our website. Technical support and CPE questions may be addressed to Nathan McElveen at nmcelveen@grfcpa.com. Today's learning objective is to provide attendees with best practices to ensure effective governance continues at nonprofits during COVID-19. I will now introduce our speakers for today's webinar. Walt Derengowski is a partner in the audit department here at GRF. Mr. Derengowski has over 18 years of public accounting experience with GRF CPAs Advisors, servicing the nonprofit sector exclusively. He manages audits for a wide variety of nonprofit clients like trade associations, charitable organizations, non-governmental organizations, private foundations, political action committees, and other similar institutions. He frequently travels internationally, working with clients to audit federal award programs in accordance with the Uniform Guidance/OMB circulars. Omid Mohebi is a manager with GRF CPAs Advisors. He joined the firm in 2011 and specializes in audits of nonprofit organizations and employee benefit plans. Mr. Mohebi has presented to clients, nonprofit professionals and board members, and other key industry stakeholders on the latest nonprofit accounting standards. In addition, he serves as board treasurer and chair of the finance committee of a prominent nonprofit organization in Washington, D.C., where he oversees all aspects of financial control and adherence to the latest accounting standards. I'll now turn the presentation over to our speakers.
Thank you, Dunya, and good morning. Omid and I are both pleased that you can attend today's webinar. Today, we are going to go through board governance in a time of COVID. These are very trying times we are all living in. And who would have known that we would be quarantining for over a year now since COVID hit back in March 2020. The good thing is the vaccines are rolling out a lot quicker and many people are becoming vaccinated. Today's webinar, Omid and I will give you a little insight of what we have been seeing in the industry and how it may impact you and your organizations. But before we get started, please make sure you look at our website for any future webinars we offer at GRF. We have a huge archived library of previously offered webinars that have been recorded under the resource section. We also, on our website, have future webinars that we offer to you, and there is a lot of useful information, so don't miss out. Next screen. So today's discussion topics, where are we in 2021 as the pandemic continues? One good thing to note is I am starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel as more people become vaccinated and are heading back to work. You could also tell this because traffic has significantly increased several months ago and has started becoming unbearable again, especially in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. Secondly, we are going to discuss what things as board members we can and cannot control. Because as board members, we have a fiduciary responsibility to steer the organization towards a sustainable future. But unfortunately, there are things that will be completely out of our control. Next, we are going to discuss internal controls and why internal controls are so important, and also why it's important to reevaluate the internal control environment, especially if your organization, who very well may still be working remotely, there are increased risks that potentially could increase threats such as fraud and other irregularities from being perpetrated against your organization being in this remote environment. And this is something that board members are going to have to evaluate and maybe perform some risk assessment of those potential threats. And how has the organization alleviated those risks? In addition, we are briefly going to go through reasons on how organizations can streamline the audit process and to ensure efficiencies and where potential audit cost overages could be eliminated. And then lastly, we will look at some of the benefits to remote work has been and how can your organization use this to their advantage. Next slide. This slide here has some really good articles and other reading material that I recommend that you check out. Many of the articles provide the same findings and analysis of where the nonprofit industry is heading and many of the struggles they will face for many years post-COVID. One thing to mention is during 2020, many people were working remotely, and if the nonprofit did not think outside the box and become entrepreneurial, then the organization would find themselves not succeeding. In a recent survey of large and medium-sized nonprofits, they found that 83% had lost revenue and 71% had reduced programming. The findings suggest that all types of revenue may be declining across all organizational types. And because of the COVID-19 pandemic, you will start to notice shifts in services and demands for human services, which can increase resource needs. For example, domestic violence is increasing and food banks are seeing sharp increases in need due to rising unemployment and shortages of food in some areas. The National Association of Free and Charitable Clinics reported that demand for services has increased for 74% of its members. In the long term, organizations that assist the homeless may see increased demand, as was the case in the 2008 economic recession. Other nonprofits such as arts and humanities, education, non-COVID related healthcare units have seen a decrease in demand. I sit on a board as an audit committee chair for a nonprofit in DC area, and their mission is in the arts and humanities, and they have seen a significant decrease in funding, unfortunately. Next slide. Nonprofit organizations must take the opportunity to explore new innovative means for funding. This has led to an extraordinary challenge for many nonprofit organizations. An approach that nonprofit organizations may consider is to diversify revenue streams and seek new sources of revenue. As a board member, these are the type of discussions that should be happening regularly at board meetings and with management. If your organization only receives donations from foundations, well, maybe thinking about exploring other avenues for funding, like individual contributions, pledges, contracts, or even federal government grants. Board members are also really going to need to think about remote work and what potential risk this could still potentially pose on the organization. With many people still working remotely, there could be increased risk of fraud and other irregularities. Under the fraud triangle, under the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, there are 3 elements normally required. The first is the opportunity. The second is pressure, also known as incentive or motivation. And the third is rationalization. And COVID-19 definitely has created additional pressure on many workers' lives as a result of lost jobs, reduced hours, health concerns, medical bills, and the future uncertainty. Then, the list goes on and on. Who knows where our country is going to go? From my perspective, a lot of the stimulus money that has been awarded through the CARES Act, from my perspective, that's nothing more than a Band-Aid on a flesh wound. When that stimulus money ends, who knows? It's really important that the board have management revisit the internal control environment and brainstorm with management on what areas could your organization be vulnerable, whether IT risk, staffing shortages, which could create an environment of having inadequate segregation of duties, which could elevate the risk of potential fraud and other irregularities. Also, with the vaccines quickly rolling out, are nonprofits going to be quick to go back to the office? I know the last 4 months, I've had several clients reach out to me to see what they could do to get out of their current lease. And I told them to consult with their attorney, and good luck, because not many landlords are going to be willing to renegotiate the lease in the time of COVID. It is very important that the board members understand that they have a fiduciary duty to support the nonprofits and the staff through these challenging times. Next slide. It's good that there has been a lot of stimulus package funding through the CARES Act, as I alluded to in the previous PowerPoint slide. You know, and without this source of funding, I truly believe the unemployment level would have been a lot higher. The PPP program is one of the largest programs under the CARES Act. The United States Small Business Administration loans were provided to help businesses keep their workforce employed during the COVID-19 crisis. The PPP program is the only program that is not subject to the single audit and not included on the schedule of expenditures of federal awards. I have seen in the industry so far that many of the PPP loans that have been forgiven were forgiven with no problems. And to qualify for the new PPP loan that just recently came out, there are a couple of criteria. First, your business must have less than 300 employees. Secondly, you must demonstrate that the revenue reduction of at least 25% in the first, second, or third quarter of 2020 when compared with the same quarter in 2019. And third, your business needs to have been operational before February 15, 2020 and remain operational today. For financial statement purposes, there are two ways the PPP can be treated once it's been forgiven. One way is to treat it as a loan. When the loan has been forgiven by the bank, the nonprofit will recognize revenue as this forgiveness of debt or extinguishment of debt. Or the second is to treat this as a conditional contribution. And as the auditee has met the condition and documented that they met the conditions, which is more administrative in nature, then the nonprofit can recognize the revenue as they have met those conditions. Now, please note, management's position should be clearly documented along with any other government assistance. There's also the Employee Retention Tax Credit, which was also granted under the CARES Act. The Small Business Employee Retention Credit lets eligible employees take a 70% credit up to $10,000. Again, the maximum credit amount per employee per quarter is $7,000. That means that the maximum retention credit available is $7,000 per employee per calendar quarter, for a total of $14,000 for the first 2 calendar quarters of 2021. The credit reduces the employer's Social Security tax liability. Next slide.
Thanks, Walt. We've now come to our first polling question. Did your organization receive the Paycheck Protection Program loan? A, yes. B, no. C, unsure. Please take a moment now to answer. While participants are submitting their answers, I'll provide the first CPE word. The first CPE word is loan. If you want to receive CPE credit, please jot these words down because you will need them for the survey following the webinar. Again, the first CPE word is loan, L-O-A-N. So to answer, 58% of people said yes, they have received a Paycheck Protection Program loan. 33% said no, and 8% said unsure.
Thank you, Dunya. And I was not surprised to see that outcome that, more than half of the people did tap into the PPP loan, because who know, where we were going to go with, the economic uncertainty and how long this was going to last. So that was not surprising. Next slide. Now, for those organizations who received U.S. federal funding, the updated 2020 compliance supplement was released in August 2020, and the addendum was released 4 months later on December 22nd, 2020. We were all patiently waiting for the compliance supplement as it was anticipated to come out a lot earlier than August 2020. One thing to note is the addendum was released to address new federal programs established by the CARES Act and the impact of COVID-19 on existing programs. The addendum's effective date is for audits of fiscal years beginning after June 30th, 2019, and it must be used in conjunction with the August 2020 compliance supplement. Please note, reports issued prior to the publication of the addendum are not required to adhere to the addendum requirements. And there are 8 new COVID-19 federal programs and 6 pre-existing programs to which COVID-19 funding compliance requirements have been added. With all the new federal funding, there are going to be additional compliance attributes that the auditors are going to have to test. And hopefully your organization that receives US federal funding and they require uniform guidance audit, it would be good for management to have read the compliance supplement and the addendum. This could potentially have a significant impact on your organization, especially if you receive US federal funding that is COVID related. Next slide. Now, as board members, we cannot control many of the factors related to the pandemic, but we can provide guidance and help the nonprofit steer in the right direction. Our role as board members are to direct, oversee, and protect. It's also good if the nonprofit board composition is diversified with different professionals from a different area of expertise, like law, fundraising, marketing, IT, finance, or have someone on the board who is a CPA and has nonprofit experience. With many people still working remotely, the internal control environment should have been modified to address the change. For example, how are payments being processed in this remote environment? Also, are we teaching employees of the organization about phishing and other phone scams? This is the most common method of the most successful fraud scheme utilized. Fraudsters can pose as anyone from an individual claiming to be interested in contributing to the partners or partnering with the organization, an employee of their bank, or even a vendor seeking payment. In fact, there was a recent fraud in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area of a nonprofit that had over $7.5 million of their endowment stolen just by a phishing scheme. Other general procedures an organization can implement and can aid to help protect against fraud and other improprieties is to provide frequent training to employees. One security awareness program that I believe is very good for training, I've used it several times, and it kind of goes through some of the general do's and don'ts. It's called Know Before. I'm not sure of the costs, but they have a pricing scale depending on the number of employees who will be utilizing the training features. And it kind of have a scale of if you want a silver, a gold, platinum, or diamond status. Something else to note, that showing proof of the employee training can help reduce the cost of any cyber insurance. As a board members, it's really important to have these conversations, again, with the organization and evaluate potential risks to the organization. In addition, the board or audit committee should have preliminary calls or a preliminary call several weeks prior to audit fieldwork is scheduled to discuss the audit process. In previous years, the audit may have been on site, but due to COVID, the audit may be performed virtually. And will the nonprofit be able to handle a virtual audit? Do they have the bandwidth? Paper documents should all be scanned and stored in a secure server location or uploaded into the cloud. In addition, requesting the audit list from the auditors in advance of fieldwork will also help in preparing for the audit. It would be good to delegate to several members of management of the team or each person to be tasked and to provide due dates. This will ensure that each person is accountable, and this will also really streamline the audit process and make it a lot more efficient. The last thing to think about here is the benefit of working in a remote work environment. Many costs will significantly have reduced due to not traveling, less printing costs, less office supplies, telephone, and the list goes on and on. With less costs being incurred, that money can be used for other unforeseen costs or costs that were not originally budgeted for. For an example, there will be a cost to get the office space up to speed with CDC guidelines, and you will need extra wipes, hand washing areas, and personal protection equipment. Next slide. In the most recent survey, and it was more of a governance survey conducted by Board Source, only 58% of the organizations reported use a formal written self-assessment to evaluate the board's effectiveness. Now, we think that more nonprofits would benefit from a self-assessment process. And we're not sure why more boards do not regularly assess their own performance, but perhaps they just don't feel prepared to do so. The board that I sit on, that was one thing that we initiated is making an active role of what is the role of each board member and how are they going to contribute to management. In one way to start, and this is what we did, is each board member to reflect on his or own role as a board member is just to have a general discussion about the role of the board in general. Then put the topic on the agenda for a future board meeting. I guarantee you're going to be astonished at how frequently this basic but beneficial discussion is overlooked. Many people serving on a nonprofit's board have never done so before, and others may have served on a nonprofit board that has different expectations for board members. So a basic discussion about the role of the board will help set consistent expectations. Once expectations are managed, the next step is to invite board members to participate in a self-assessment process that will reveal how far away or not the board believes it is from the expectations it set for itself. The results of the self-assessment can help identify issues needing clarification and address any gaps in skills board members believe they need for the board to be successful. And topics for future board education, and importantly, the self-assessment process will engage the board in the same process that the nonprofit itself should be quite familiar with, and measuring its own effectiveness. The bottom line is that effective boards are those that regularly and candidly ask themselves, how can we do better? And with that, I will turn it over to Omid.
Thanks, Walt. Well, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you today. We're going to talk a little bit about internal controls now. And let's start off with a very fundamental definition of internal controls. As you can see, internal controls are defined as the mechanisms, rules, and procedures implemented by management of an organization to ensure the integrity of financial and accounting information, promote accountability, and prevent fraud. Now you notice that the definition refers to the word management. However, you as board members are also part of this effort. There's a combined responsibility between management and the board to ensure that internal controls at your organization are appropriate. Now, internal controls right now are more important than ever before because of the virtual working environment. The whole nature of the work that your organization does has been changed, both internally and externally. And we're also going to look at some examples of internal controls. You can see some examples given there just at the bottom of the slide. Well, the most important perhaps is the separation or the segregation of duties, as it's commonly referred to. And just to give you a definition, a sort of formal definition by the AICPA, defines the segregation of duties as a basic building block of sustainable risk management and internal controls for a business. And the basic premise of this, they go on to say, is that you have shared responsibilities, and you disperse critical functions within key processes. And by doing this, you are lessening the probability of errors and certainly the probability of fraud. And the other thing to point out about the segregation of duties, it is not a constant at any point in time. It's something that needs to be continuously reviewed and reevaluated. And that is certainly the case right now with the change in the working environment, with people working from home. Segregation of duties needs to be reevaluated each and every day. Let's go on to the next slide, please. We're now going to look at the sort of the three main categories of internal controls. Let's start with preventative. Well, by definition, these are controls that are designed to prevent errors from occurring in the first place. Let's look at some examples. Well, segregation of duties is certainly one of those. By segregating duties appropriately, you are trying to prevent the occurrence of errors and certainly fraud. Some other examples, physical controls. You can have a safe where you lock up your cash. That's preventative. You can have a locked door which prevents access to a certain room which contains confidential information. That's a preventative controls. And also in the IT sphere, you can have preventative controls where you have access to certain software only by authorized employees with certain passwords. Let's move on to detective internal controls. Again, by definition, these are designed to detect errors after they have occurred. Some examples here, for example, the physical inventory check. If you have physical inventory, is your inventory really what you believe it to be according to your financial records? Another example is the review of bank reconciliations. Have any errors occurred where you can detect those? And of course, once an error is detected, then you have to take corrective action. And this is where corrective internal controls come into play. Some examples of these. In the IT sphere again, software patches. We all receive regular updates from software vendors with enhancements which enhance the security features of their software. That's a corrective internal control. Another example would be new and updated policies and procedures. If certain policies and procedures of your organization previously increased the risk of errors and also led to errors, then you want to make sure you change those policies and procedures. And that would be a corrective action. Next slide, please. Let's now focus on the virtual environment and talk a little bit about what are the changes and adjustments that need to be made to your internal controls as a result of the current virtual environment. Things have changed. We're not going to go back to the way things were with everyone working from the office. The likelihood is that it's going to be some kind of hybrid arrangement, but certainly things have changed forever and we need to adjust internal controls accordingly. Next slide, please. Let's look at a few of these bullet points on this slide. Well, we talked about the fact that segregation of duties certainly needs to be changed on an ongoing basis. And certainly right now, because of the risks and challenges posed by the virtual work environment. You also need to look at certain procedures that were followed before when everyone was at the physical office, which just cannot be done in the same way now. For example, deposit of cash receipts such as checks. Someone may have gone to the bank once a week or twice a week with the appropriate approval of the deposit slip and the review of checks. Well, that can't be done now because first of all, no one's at the office perhaps, and people aren't really going to the bank. So if you don't have the capability, you need to invest in software for the remote deposit of checks. Disbursements, again, previously someone may have filled in a check request form with details that may have been approved by the appropriate person, and then there would have been appropriate segregation of someone signing the check. Again, that's not going to be possible now. So you need to have an online disbursement software, of which there are many, which has the appropriate levels of approval built into the software. So the disbursement simply won't be made unless those approvals are given. Once you've amended or updated your segregation of duties and your procedures and your software, you also need to update your policies and procedures. You can't just give people, your staff, the software and tell them about the new roles they have and just leave the procedures as they were before. So the procedures need to be formally updated and a copy needs to be given to the individuals concerned. And following that, you need to provide training. Again, you can't just give them the software and give them the copy of the new procedures and leave it at that. They need to be trained appropriately. You need to bring in external trainers if necessary to make sure that they have the appropriate training to use the software, to know what the new procedures are and who's doing what. Everyone needs to be clear. And again, some more examples there at the bottom regarding some revised procedures. You can have revised procedures with respect to review of bank statements, investment statements. Previously, they would have come in the mail. You would have had appropriate segregation of duties with respect to who opens the mail, who is the first person to see the bank statements and review them, and getting passed to the person perhaps who does the bank reconciliation, and so on and so forth. Again, that's all been turned upside down. So you need to have the appropriate procedures of who accesses bank statements online, downloads them, signs off on them, who does it go to next, and so on. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Omid. We've come to our second polling question. Has your organization made any changes to internal controls as a result of the virtual environment? A, yes. B, no. C, unsure. Please take a moment now to answer. While participants are submitting their answers, I'll provide the second CPE word. The second CPE word is control. If you want to receive CPE credit, please jot these words down because you will need them for the survey following the webinar. Again, the second CPE word is control. C-O-N-T-R-O-L. It looks like the results have posted. 57% of people said yes, 23% responded with no, and 20% responded unsure.
Thanks, Sonia. Okay, let's look at some specific risks which are affecting nonprofit organizations. Well, there's a whole host of examples at the bottom there, so we're not going to go through every single one, but let's just look at a few. Well, we've already talked about fraud. Fraud and theft is certainly on the rise, particularly because controls have been weakened due to the remote working environment. Also, because individuals are working mainly from home, there is a possibility that your culture will be diluted over time. People don't really know what you stand for and what is your mission. So the organization, and particularly the board of directors, needs to be very active in this, needs to ensure that employees and indeed board members are still fully aware and focus on the mission of the organization. They're fully aware of what the accepted culture is and maintain that. Other risks perhaps include compliance of laws and regulations. Again, because everyone's spread out working from home, you need to make sure that no one takes their eye off the ball and forgets that you need to comply with certain regulatory local laws, state laws, federal laws, registration, charity registrations, and so on. So that needs to be at the top of your list. And we've just given an example on the right. This is one of the services we provide at GRF, where we provide an enterprise risk management assessment, where we essentially look at the risks affecting our organization, and we publish a full assessment of those risks and how they affect the organization. Next slide, please. Now, just some facts here regarding the increase in fraud that both Walt and I referred to. You'll see that a recent study found over 180,000 fraud cases between January and August 2020. That is a lot. There was a report from Accounting Today that this has affected every category. So it's not just nonprofits, it's not just for-profits, it's affecting publicly listed companies, and it's also affecting the federal government. You'll see the reference there to the PPP program. There have been many, many fraudulent claims, unfortunately, under the PPP scheme. And I know that the federal government is acting very, giving great scrutiny to try to identify those individuals and those parties who defrauded the system. But it's an unfortunate side effect of this program, which of course has had many benefits throughout our nation, but just to show that fraud does occur everywhere, including the federal government. Next slide, please. Now, we spoke about internal controls. Let's also look at some other items that can lead to reduced risk. Training. You can train your employees. And again, this is not just by management. This is mainly the focus of the board of directors as well. You have to ensure that in your fiduciary responsibility of overseeing the organization, that senior management and all employees of the organization are clear about the policy for ethical behavior. They need to know what that means and what is expected of them. Employees need to be clear about how to communicate suspected fraudulent activity, and also perhaps give them training on how to identify potential fraudulent activity. One of the areas that's becoming increasingly important is cyber insurance. Now, it may be that you have some elements of cyber insurance as part of your umbrella policy. However, what we have found is that is usually insufficient, and it's pretty general. It's not tailored to the specific requirements of your organization. So we advise the board of directors to work with management to review the cyber insurance that you may have, make sure that it is amended appropriately, that it's tailored for your organization. And in addition, as Walt mentioned before, if you do give the training to your employees, make sure that's documented somehow, because in many cases, you will be able to reduce your premiums just by showing that you have good policies, good training, and that will reduce your premiums. Next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit about the annual audit. Again, this was touched on earlier, but let's talk a little bit more. Walt and I are both auditors, so you're getting the sort of the first-hand experience. So previously, the process was we'd start, of course, planning ahead. The engagement letter would go out. We'd get the list of PBC items that we needed off to the client in advance, of course. Samples would also go out in advance. But typically, most of the support was given to us once we were there physically at the client's office. We'd turn up and there was a ton of paper waiting for us, and we loved it. We still do. Things have changed. And so now we're starting the planning process much earlier, even earlier than before. We want to make sure the client is very clear about how it's going to work, how the remote audit process is going to work for them, how the communication is going to work. We make sure they know that we intend to send them almost as many samples as we can in advance. And the reason is that in many cases, many of their support items are in paper form. So they need to go and find those and scan them and upload them to the portal. Even if their support is in electronic form, they may not be readily accessible. So they need time to organize those and upload those electronically. We also have regular video conferencing calls before the audit process to make sure that, again, they're clear about how it's going to work during field work, and of course, post field work, so that everyone is clear and we have an effective and efficient audit. Next slide, please. Let's talk about the benefits of remote work and how it can actually be turned into an asset for your organization. You know, a lot has been said about the risks and the increase in fraud and the increase in the likelihood of errors, but there are many benefits. And the important thing for your organization is that you identify those benefits and you leverage them to the extent possible. Because as we've said many times, the remote work, at least to some extent, and the remote audits and so on are here to stay to a much greater extent than before. So of course, one of the key benefits is you're less dependent on paper. Less paper means less storage space, less filing cabinets. Less filing cabinets means less square footage needed to put those filing cabinets on. And square footage, certainly here in the Washington, D.C. area, metro area, is very expensive. So immediately you're lessening your need for physical space and hopefully lessening your need for rent. The 2 rooms that you had for physical space, you could possibly sublet. So you have rental income. Of course, you're going to increase environmental practice, the environmental friendliness of your practices and reduce your carbon footprint. So whether or not your mission is an environmental one, it doesn't matter. You can do your part in increasing environmentally friendly practices. And having electronic records generally means that there's generally less need to scan documents, not just during the audit process, but throughout the year. So imagine all the time your employees are spending in a typical year prior to the pandemic, when they were just scanning stuff. Imagine all the other responsibilities that they can be assigned to if they weren't there spending their time just standing there in front of the scanner. Next slide, please. Let's look at some other benefits. We talked about electronic storage of documents. Again, these can be on a secure server, password protected, regular backups. And this will also help you implement your organization's document retention and destruction policy. If you don't have one, you should have one. It's best practice. And we certainly give a recommendation to any of our clients who don't have one. And if you do have one, it will make it much easier for you to implement that policy. You won't have to go looking in filing cabinets to say and ask, oh, how long have we had this document? Do we need to keep it? When was it? Everything's on a server somewhere. You know what it is, and you know how long it's been there. And we talked about software before. You can build in multiple levels of approvals and review and approval into your softwares for anything from disbursements to review and approval of journal entries and bank reconciliations and so on. Next slide, please.
We now come to our 3rd polling question. Do you believe your organization has leveraged the benefits of the virtual environment? A, yes. B, no. C, unsure. Please take a moment now to answer. While participants are submitting their answers, I'll provide the 3rd CPE word. The 3rd CPE word is document. If you want to receive CPE credit, please jot these words down because you will need them for the survey following the webinar. Again, the 3rd CPE word is document. D-O-C-U-M-E-N-T. Looks like the results have posted. 71% of people have responded yes, 19% no, 10% unsure.
Thank you, Dunya. Okay, now, of course, the key focus of this webinar is towards board members and governance. So let's focus a little bit more about how the remote working environment affects board members specifically. Now, the board treasurer or the chair of the finance committee or any members of the finance committee can have ready access to any financial documents They can look at budgets and budgets versus actual analysis and look at monthly financials. They don't need to wait for the accounting team to email those to them. They can be uploaded to some sort of dashboard where you can have secure access and you can go in there and review those items in preparation for your finance committee call. Also, fundraising activities. Now, your nonprofit may or may not have fundraising, and you may or may not have a fundraising team. But even if you do have a fundraising team, filling in grant applications and submitting grant reports to grantors is a very time-consuming activity. So perhaps if you have a fundraising committee, or even if you don't, certain members of the board of directors can help your fundraising team. Ask how you can help with the completing grant applications. And again, this could all be stored on some sort of server, on some sort of dashboard where you can go in, review the application, communicate with the management team about which sections you might be able to help with, and also grant reports. If you receive grants, the likelihood is you're going to have to provide narrative and financial reports back upstream to the grantor. Can you help with those? Again, certainly the finance activity or the fundraising, the finance committee or the fundraising committee, or any board members can help in some way. And we all know that when you have board minutes or committee minutes, the minutes get emailed around and everyone has to check them for errors or changes. Well, that can all be done on a central dashboard. No need for all those emails. Everyone has to go in. You get a notification that they're on the dashboard. You go in, you make any comments about changes or corrections. And of course, after that, they will be approved formally at the next committee or board meeting. Next slide, please. Let's look at some other ways that board members are affected. Procurement decisions. If your organization is making a major purchase, you can certainly make sure that your organization's procurement policy is being adhered to. There could be a place on the dashboard where you can go and look at competitive bids. You can look at any documentation with respect to sole source procurements and help in those decisions. Certainly for major decisions, the board members need to be involved. One of the things that we of course always recommend is that all employees, not just senior management, have an annual formal performance review, and the executive director is no exception. Again, the executive director's performance review is pretty time consuming. So there could be a place on a dashboard where all the relevant documents are stored, perhaps the executive director's goals, and you can go in there and fill in the performance review if you're a board member. No need for all those documents to be emailed around. Now, if you have a HR committee, fine, they can do that. But certainly those documents can be held on a secure server. Compliance with policies and procedures. And finally, at the bottom, the legal fees. If you have an attorney on your board, you certainly want to make the most of that to save on legal fees. So that attorney can have access to potential agreements, contracts, or any other items to review and provide advice on. That way you don't have to go to a lawyer who charges you a lot of money. Next slide, please. So what are the key takeaways? Well, we talked about that governance is certainly more critical now than ever before because of the risks and the changing work environment caused by the pandemic. That there's certain tools that are available to help your organization, and many of the changes posed by the virtual environment can be turned into an asset for your organization and for board members. There are many implications for the audit process to make it more efficient and more effective. And a final reminder that you as board members are not just there to turn up to board meetings. You have a fiduciary responsibility of governance, of effective governance, and overseeing the operations of your organization.
We'd now like to answer some questions that we received from the audience. The first question is, how can a board find good people when recruiting?
Thank you, Dunya. I will take that. That is a really good question. The board that I sit on, we had that same problem of trying to find and recruit new board members. The first thing that we did is create a nominating committee within the board that could help that could start steered in the right direction to finding new recruits. The other thing is look into your own network. Your LinkedIn is a great tool that you could use to try and find new board members within your own circle and on your network. And the third thing is board source is another outlook that board members could look at. If looking, filter it, determine what kind of candidate you're looking for, whether it's in the IT, marketing, legal, finance, and then board source could be a good resource for the organization to use.
The second question is, how have your audit clients generally performed with completely virtual audits?
Thanks, Sonia. I think I can take that. Very well overall, I would say. No one knew what to expect when we were first aware that our audits would have to be done virtually, and there was a slight feeling of apprehension, I'm sure both on our part and on the part of our clients. But looking back over the last year, I think we've all been very pleasantly surprised at how everyone adapted. The big word now has been pivot. That's become a buzzword, but let's just say adapted to the new working environment. And it was all a case of good communication between us and our clients, making sure that everyone was clear about how we're going to get stuff done, and following up. So overall, I would say that everyone has done very well. There have been a few who've been perhaps a little bit more heavily paper-based, but again, everyone is realizing that the way forward is to move to electronic records.
The next question is, do you know any organizations that can perform a board governance assessment?
Oh, that's a great question. Dunya, I'll take that. In fact, at GRF CPAs, our risk advisory service, that's one of the services that we can provide, is performing a board governance governance assessment. It's looking at the board composition. Other key performance indicators could be looking at the diversity, equity, and inclusion, which has been a very hot topic recently. Looking at risk. But yeah, our GRF CPAs and advisors is something that could help your organization steer in the right direction and perform that board governance assessment.
And Omid, you mentioned the importance of segregation of duties. What advice do you have for smaller nonprofits with limited personnel who are all working virtually? How can they achieve good segregation of duties?
Thanks, Dunya. Of course, look, we're realistic. We realize that not all nonprofits have the luxury of having a number of people working in the finance team, an accounting team, and so on. So there are a number of organizations out there where perhaps they just don't have the number of individuals necessary to achieve what we will call a very strong segregation of duties. So you just have to do the best you can with the individuals you have. But again, you need to sit down, look at the procedures, look at the individuals that you can use, see how you can share those responsibilities that we talked about, those critical functions between those individuals in a way where you're building in several levels of control, strong controls, to prevent possibilities of errors and possibilities of fraud. A lot of times when you do sit down and you look at the structure, you can find some good ways of actually making things much stronger.
And last question before we wrap up is, can you expand on ways board members can help with an organization's fundraising efforts?
Sure. Well, I touched on that earlier. And, as I said, many foundations, for example, don't have the luxury of having a full-time fundraising person. And even if they do, that person is very busy. So board members can certainly help with making phone calls to potential donors, going out to lunch. Well, nowadays you can't go out to lunch, but you can have certainly a Zoom lunch or, a Zoom drink after hours. So there's a lot of things you can do. So all you need to do is reach out to the appropriate fundraising person and just ask, what can I do? Can I help organize an online fundraising event? Can I reach out to potential donors? Can I even write an email, a thank you email to a donor who gave us some donation. Can I just write on? That will help that fundraising individual and just take a lot of stuff off their plate. And that will be to the benefit of the organization.
All right, thank you, Walt and Nomi. With that, we would like to thank everyone for attending today's discussion. We encourage you to follow us on social media at GRF CPAs and visit our website at www.grfcpa.com for upcoming events and alerts. Please remember to complete the survey that will appear automatically following the session if you would like to earn CPE credit for attending today's discussion. Thank you again and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.